Thank you, Mr Acting President. And I too would like to commend the Honourable Laurie Graham for bringing this very good motion to this House to be discussed here today. I would like to start just by just putting a little warning to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders who may be listening or reading this speech into the future, that advising you that I may mention names of people who have passed on. So firstly, I would like to start by paying my respects to all the people involved in that massive strike back 75 years ago. As the Honourable Alana McGinn alluded to, the MUA, the union that I come from, has a very big history of supporting Aboriginal rights across this country that span back right to the 1800s in the Barcaldine strike in North Queensland, which led to the forming of the Labor Party, that strike. But what they did there was they black banned wool exports in Queensland whilst the shearers were on strike up in Barcaldine. That strike is hugely significant, and people should definitely look into that, I think, if you want a taste of history of workers' rights in this country. But I first got engaged in Aboriginal activism in the Northern Territory under the leadership of Thomas Mayer at the MUA in Northern Territory. But there was a man that had a great history from the MUA in a strike that came out of, as it seems, inspired by this 1946 strike, and that is, of course, the Gurindji people Wave Hill walk-off. There was a man in the MUA and up until his passing was a massive activist for people who were vulnerable, and that was Brian Manning. Brian Manning was a wharfie at the time during the Wave Hill walk-off, and he would get in his old truck and fill it full of supplies and food and water and drive that truck out to Wave Hill to where the strikers were. And every year the Wave Hill walk-off is remembered and people who were involved in that celebrated for what was a huge change in Australia around Aboriginal rights. But turning to the 1946 strike, it is amazing doing research, as members have already mentioned, and just hearing the hardships that took place. You know, comments around bosses that would go around and kick Aboriginal people who are on the ground while they're asleep and say, "Get up, time to go to work." Total disrespect, slave mentality that came out of some of these pastoralists. And what astounds me is that 800 people got together right across different stations, managed to communicate in a way that they understood. Obviously, literacy and numeracy was an issue in that day and age, and also today. So we're able to organise themselves with the tools to understand that withdrawing your labour is the only right we have as human beings in the working workforce. And that's something that I think should never be taken away. The opportunity for someone to take a stand with their labour and withdraw it, I think is an entitlement we're all given from birth, and that should be something that should be respected and protected well into the future. And that is exactly what these men and women did. They took their opportunity to line it up with May 1st due to the starting of the shearing season to make full impact, which is a genuine strategy to ensure that when they do withdraw their labour, that maximum impact is felt, to ensure that they get the desired outcome that they're after. What a massive amount of time that would have gone into the communications within itself around the Pilbara back in the 1940s would have been very difficult. I could only imagine the road infrastructure and the lack of it, and communication ability, but also obviously Aboriginal people, the migration in which people move around. I know that it is stated that people were locked to stations and they couldn't leave, but I would probably suggest that there were people that were going between groups that weren't on the pastoral stations doing the work, but were acting more as union organisers in that space and ensuring that everyone was on target to make sure that they all went out at the exact same time to get exactly that maximum impact. So I want to just refer to an article I found during some research, which I think is really interesting. It was the 15th of November in 2020 by ABC News, remembering the 1946 Pilbara strike, Australia's longest, that paved the way for Indigenous rights. Well, there's a story in here, and I gave my precursor because I am going to mention someone who passed on. Mr. Smith, Marshall Smith, has referred to his cousin, who was 19 years of age, and he's passed on now, Monty Smith. And when he went across to Mount Brockman Station as a horsebreaker. The station manager at the time was a very hard man, an ex-boxer, who didn't take any nonsense, and he would boot the Aboriginal workers in their swags to wake them up, and sometimes go as far as whipping them with a stock whip to get them out of their swags. It must have been a fairly serious hiding, because my cousin left the Pilbara straight away, walking to Carnarvon, where he remained for the rest of his life until he passed on. Walking from the Pilbara down to Carnarvon, such a vast area to walk. So this is a 19-year-old who was subject to that. And I'd assume when he says here that he left, that it would have been under some type of runaway rather than being allowed to leave, I think, which would have meant why he went so far to get away. There is obviously so many stories, and already mentioned Don McLeod and Dooley Bin Bin and Clancy. They were obviously key parts of this, and you would think that just coordinating it and having activists go around and get people to agree to withdraw their labour in a first for Western Australia in the Aboriginal space for rights would have been such an interesting conversation to hear today, to see the passion of these people to ensure that Aboriginal people were given better rights and not treated as second-class citizens, which they undoubtedly were treated. The strike was coordinated and led by obviously Dooley Bin Bin and Clancy McKenna. The strike was most effective in the Pilbara region. Further afield in Broome and Derby and other inland towns, there was a lot of police suppression. So the police were able to rally further around forcing Aboriginal people back to work and forcing them out of the strike. But what is significant and what I'm proud of is also that, as I mentioned earlier, not only were the waterfront workers involved in the Bar Colden strike in the 1800s, but the Seamen's Union played a pivotal role in getting this strike ended by putting a black ban on wool and taking a stand with Aboriginal people to improve workers' rights and their life in general, which I am always very proud of when I read through the history of the Maritime Union, which is amalgamated through many unions, but specifically the Waterfront Workers Federation and the Seamen's Union of Australia, who came together in 1993. But the Seamen's Union had a huge history, as I said, of standing up for Aboriginal rights, and being able to coordinate from the pastoral stations into the maritime sector of export, such a sophisticated thing to do. In today's day and age would be secondary boycott, but I think that back then it was clear that it was the only angle was to ensure that other industries got behind Aboriginal workers and stood for them side by side. And as I said, that reflected onto the Wayfield walk-off, where the Gurindji took a stand, and right around other spaces. But what I think I have definitely noticed is you look at the later years in the 90s, where you get to the 60s, the 70s and the 80s, and there's so many great stories of Aboriginal stockmen, particularly out of Halls Creek and Fitzroy, where there was work being done and for pay. And I think that there is a definite ode paid to the strike that happened in 1946 because of that. I will mention quickly, with the 20 seconds I have left, that across this country there is lots of situations where Aboriginal people were treated like this and their wages were not paid and still have not been paid. and I know in Queensland there's been massive activists trying to push and rally around getting these wages returned to the people like they deserve.